Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. And welcome back to Newcastle in the 1800s, from penal settlement to Coalopolis. In our last episode, Society member Julie Keating explored the discovery of coal in Newcastle and the early struggles of the penal colony. Today, she picks up the story as monopolies, industrial ambition, and engineering ingenuity reshape the city's future. From the rise and fall of the AA Company's coal dominance to daring harbour developments and the extension of railway lines, this episode uncovers how innovation, conflict, and sheer determination laid the foundations for Newcastle's booming coal trade.
This podcast is the second of two parts in a series on my book Newcastle in the 1800s, from penal settlement to Coalopolis. The first podcast covered the discovery of coal in Newcastle and the establishment of a penal colony. Convicts mined the coal, but this was an inefficient and unreliable process. Although the government gave the Australian Agricultural Company, the AA Company, monopoly control of coal in the Hunter, other players wanted part of the lucrative trade. The monopoly agreement, which was signed in 1827, gave the company access to the coal resources for a period of 31 years. For transporting the coal, there were ongoing issues concerning the safety of the harbour entrance. It was difficult to navigate and almost inaccessible to sailing vessels in rough weather. There were some natural features affecting its accessibility: a rock ledge at the entrance and an extensive and shallow sandbank, known as the Oyster Bank. This was only 5 feet below the surface. A harbour development plan was formulated by civil engineer J. Woolston Ellis in 1854. The main feature was the construction of a dyke with a shipping basin behind on the western side of the harbour. The dyke was intended to provide a gentle curve to direct the tide seaward and avoid deflections towards the Oyster Bank. It was to be built from the northern end of Carrington to a point opposite the AA Company wharf near Crown Street. Construction of the dyke would also solve another problem in the port, the lack of berthing facilities. Another major infrastructure project was the opening of the first section of the Great Northern Railway line. In March 1857, Sir William Denison, the Governor, opened the line from Honeysuckle Point, near today's Civic Station, to East Maitland. This was a major achievement and impetus to development in the area. Some of Newcastle's business people lobbied for the line to be extended to Watt Street. This extended section of railway opened in 1858. At the other end of the line, the station at East Maitland did not serve the financial district of Maitland, and the railway was eventually extended at this end as well. These extensions changed the financial dynamics of the area, as the government realised that direct access to loading facilities at the harbour could make mines in the Hunter Valley economically viable. Loading facilities had previously been provided by the private mining companies, but now the Railways Department became the chief rail provider. The government, acting under the suggestion of Colonel Barney of the Royal Engineers, intended to remove nobbies by blasting the rock. Citizens became aware of the plan and a public meeting was held in the courthouse on June 21, 1854. A petition to the Legislative Assembly requested more information on the plan be released. Colonel Barney pushed ahead with digging chambers to be filled with gunpowder. According to Bingle,
several of these were completed and filled with gunpowder sufficient not only to blow up nobbies, but to seriously injure the city, and a day was fixed for the great display.
Fortunately, the plan did not proceed. The shape of nobbies did change, however, as work commenced on preparing a level surface for the lighthouse. The resultant material was used for the breakwater, but it was not strong enough to withstand the pounding surf. Repairs had to be made on a continuing basis. Some of the opponents of the AA Company monopoly on coal rights were James and Alexander Brown and John Eales. All three had workings in the Minmi area until the Brown brothers purchased Eales Estate, which was adjacent to their land, in 1859. Eales had employed about 150 miners, and a railway line had been built across the swamp at Hexham, where it joined the Great Northern Line. Steam locomotives were used to transport the coal from the mine to this loading facility besides the Hunter River. Small ships then took the coal to Newcastle Harbour. With the monopoly lease cancelled, companies began the development of suburban coal mines. The Newcastle Wallsend Coal Company was formed to operate a coal mining venture on land bounded by Kemp, Mernon, Brooks and Brown Streets. Even though a general strike took place in 1861, its first year of operation, the mine produced 43,000 tonnes of coal. The purchase of another 8,000 acres extended the holding to take in land between Cockle Creek and Hexham. By 1862, the company's output climbed to 124,000 tonnes from pits known as A, B and C. The coal was transported by the company's private line for 3.5 miles, where it joined the Great Northern Line near Waratah. From here, coal was taken to the port and loaded from the government cranes. Several miners banded together to work the cooperative coal mine in Plattsburgh. Disgruntled by their experience working in other mines, they formed the cooperative in 1861. It was managed by a board of directors under the chairmanship of James Fletcher. Land was leased at the head of Ironbark Creek between the Newcastle Wallsend Company's estate and land owned by J&A Brown. This was the first mine in the district to be worked on the cooperative principle. Unfortunately, it was also the last. The venture did not lack the skill or the willingness to work hard. It did, however, lack the required finance. During the 1880s, the mine employed over 500 people and 74 horses were constantly working. The output in 1886 was 224,000 tonnes, with most being sent to Victoria and South Australia. The Scottish Australian Mining Company was formed in London in 1859 to obtain mining leases in the colony. Samples were taken from various sites and eventually it was decided to sink a shaft in the area near Dan Close and Durham Road in Lambton. Thomas Crowd, as a mining engineer, was appointed colliery manager. He arrived in 1862 to supervise the construction of the structures and railway line, which was to connect to the Great Northern Railway. The first train carrying coal for overseas export arrived at Newcastle in November 1863. The mine developed quickly, and in 1867 it set a record with a production of 180,000 tonnes. Output peaked in 1889 when the mine had a workforce of 552 miners. By the end of the century, the population of Lambton declined as new mines opened in the Cessnock area. A lease of land had also been obtained by the Scottish Australian Mining Company in the area now known as New Lambton. However, the company fell behind in their lease payments, and James and Alexander Brown, on hearing the news, decided to purchase the ground outright, together with the mineral rights. For their new property, the Brown brothers chose the name New Lambton Colliery to take advantage of the adjoining Lambton Colliery's established name. The coal seam worked by the New Lambton Colliery was the same as that worked at Lambton, and it would take less time for the Browns to establish the company's reputation if the name Lambton was used. The first pit was opened in 1868 in the vicinity of Oxford Street and St James Road. This pit became known as B Pit, as the Browns had an existing mine in the vicinity of Young Road, Lambton, that had commenced operation 2 years earlier. It was known as the Dog and Rat due to the large number of rats which infested the mine. It was a popular pastime for locals to bring their dogs and hunt the rats. By the early 1860s, the harbour had been deepened and larger ships were able to enter the port. More dredging was done further up the Hunter River to improve the access for river shipping. As the population expanded, areas of bushland were cleared, resulting in more silt making its way to the port. A small breakwater was planned for the northern side of the harbour from Pirate Point. According to Rosemary Melville in her book A Harbour from a Creek, this pier would create an artificial headland which would carry the entrance of the harbour into deeper water. It would also reorientate the mouth of the river to the east. This would align tidal currents in the harbour more closely with those on the coast. Ballast, mostly Melbourne bluestone, was dropped at the south-eastern tip of Pirate Point. Railway tracks were laid to carry wagons to the end of the pier. As the material built up, the railway tracks were extended. The Pirate Point sandspit originally extended 500 feet into the harbour. With the works being undertaken, it was hoped that it would eventually disappear completely. 2 lead lights were built in 1865 as a navigation aid for ships entering the harbour. When mariners had lights in both towers lined up, it indicated they were in the channel that would enable safe access. The high one is located at the corner of Tyrrell and Brown Streets and still stands today. The lower light was in Perkins Street near the Catholic Church and was demolished in 1933. Behind this lead light was the residence for the keeper of the lead lights, who had to ensure the lights were continually operating. The facilities for handling coal were inefficient, and the solution was thought to be the relocation of coal handling to the dyke at Carrington. It was also decided to install hydraulic cranes powered by water under pressure, which was stored before being carried to the cranes by underground pipes. As Carrington was a series of mudflats which were covered by high tide, much reclamation had to be undertaken. Ships coming to the port were directed to dump their ballast. This raised the ground level above the high tide mark. By 1874, the building of the dyke was complete and the first contract was let for construction of the wharves. The following year, 4 cranes were ordered from England and the hydraulic engine house was built to provide power. The cranes commenced operation in 1878. The construction was done in stages, with the cranes being installed as each section was completed. By 1890, almost all coal was shipped from the dyke. This system continued in operation until 1964, when the building was decommissioned and the cranes were demolished. Some coal mines started operation in the 1880s close to the inner city. These mines worked the borehole seam beneath the tidal waters of the Hunter River, a concept known as delta mining. 3 major harbourside collieries were established: Wickham and Bullock Island Colliery and Hetton Mine, both at Carrington, and Stockton Colliery at Stockton. Some small operations had operated prior to this. Ferndale Colliery at Tyers Hill had a leasehold of just over 200 acres, and its winding shaft was located between Henry and Ferndale Streets. It had frontage to Throsby Creek in the south and west and Bullock Island to the east. In 1878, the company won the contract to supply coal for the locomotive engines on the Great Northern Railway and the government tugboats, steam dredgers and cranes. It initially had a workforce of 152 men and boys, but this dropped to 100 by 1881. This reflected the problems associated with mining the coal seam underwater. The seam was not as thick or as valuable as originally thought, and support structures had to be drilled into sandstone, sand, mud, and pebbly conglomerate. Operating costs were high. Other small operations were the Linwood and Maryville collieries. The Linwood colliery was sunk on the property of Peter Fleming, one of the first landowners in the area. It was close to the Bullock Island colliery and the Hannell Street crossing at Wickham. The very wet and challenging conditions made it difficult for the mine to operate, and it closed in 1890. The Maryville colliery was located near the petrol terminal off Hannell Street. Instead of using iron cylinders to stabilise the shaft, bricks were used. The first attempt to mine in Stockton occurred in 1860 when Jonathan Dixon sunk a shaft. He was followed by the Scottish Australian Mining Company in 1868. It was known that there were good coal deposits beneath the southern sections of the peninsula, but the problem was that layers of clay, sand and shale lay on top of the coal. Also, being so close to the coast, the area was waterlogged and unstable. The Stockton Coal Company was formed in 1882, and sometime later a shaft was sunk to a depth of 367 feet, which was the deepest mine in the area at the time. The shaft was lined with iron cylinders, which increased production costs. However, the company saved on transportation fees as the harbour was close by and the coal could be stacked on the foreshore, ready for export. The Hetton Coal Company at Carrington was formed in 1885 with the purpose of mining under Newcastle Harbour. The working shaft was located 200 yards north of the engine house for the dyke. Iron cylinders were sunk by pressure through the sand and mud until a layer of clay was reached. Within the first 3 years, the output reached over 7,000 tonnes, mined by 250 men. The Wickham and Bullock Island Coal Company also had to line its shafts with iron cylinders, 10 feet in diameter and 3 feet in depth. They were manufactured by Morrison and Beebe, who had their premises close by. One of the shafts was in the general vicinity of Cowper and Fitzroy Streets and was close to the wharf and shipping cranes. The mine operated for 22 years until its closure in 1905. During this time, 6 fatal accidents were recorded. The company transferred operations together with some of the equipment and personnel to their Neath operation. In 1888, the government allocated funds for a basin to be constructed at the southern end of Carrington. Initially, this was to provide 4,000 feet of extra wharf space, but this was later doubled. At the time, the average depth in the proposed basin area was 3 feet 6 inches. Extensive dredging was undertaken to increase this depth. A stone wall was constructed around the basin and material dumped behind it. Blasting of rock from the harbour floor was also undertaken, and a sand pump was used to take sand and silt from the harbour and dump it behind the stone wall. There was much discussion about how to join Newcastle and Sydney by railway. The shortest route was an issue due to the need to cross the Hawkesbury River. Some people advocated that the line go inland to avoid the need for a bridge. However, the long distance required to avoid the river meant it was not feasible. The line was completed up to the river on both sides, but it was not until 1889 that the bridge was built. Passengers could then travel the entire distance by rail. Prior to this, people had to alight from the train at Pete's Ferry, board a steam ferry, travel to Gosford about 13 miles away and rejoin the train. Progress in the 1890s slowed somewhat due to outside influences such as a depression, a slump in coal prices and a prolonged drought. As inner city mines were being worked out, new mines were being developed in the outlying areas, especially around Cessnock. This also contributed to a population shift as miners moved to the new coalfields. The Federal Directory of Newcastle and District 1901 states that in 1829, 780 tonnes of coal was mined. This figure rose to more than 3 million tonnes in 1899. At that time, Newcastle was the 5th largest port in the world. For these reasons, Newcastle could appropriately be described as a Coalopolis.
Thanks once again, Julie, for this fascinating account of how private enterprise challenged monopolies, how engineers reshaped the landscape, and how the coal trade began to drive Newcastle's destiny. You can find other interesting and engaging podcasts about Newcastle and the Hunter Valley at our website, www.nfhs.org.au. We look forward to you joining us again on Newcastle Family History Society podcasts.